Right. That's right. Exactly. Or let's take the classic example of technological resistance. The Luddites, the machine breakers of Britain in the around the 1820s and 1830s.
Dr. Friedel, we live in an age when we openly, embrace new technologies and make choices accordingly. But regardless, most people are enthusiastic. We expect new technologies, constant change. But was it always like this?
No. Well, the thing is that the technologies that we live in an age where we expect technologies to change. We're constantly looking for technologies to change. That's fairly novel. It's not as novel as some people might think. I would date it from about the middle of the 19th century, when
Oh, wow. Okay.
people begin to look for new technologies and to expect that there's something new down the road, something that they might have to pay attention to, something that's going to change things, something that's going to give them new choices.
Dr. Friedel, you just went back to the middle of the 19th century and you said people, quote unquote, people begin to look for. Is that sort of like society at large or the elite of society back then?
Okay.
Like Britain, France, and I guess Germany and the US.
Uh, well, one of the things that happened in the 19th century is that the people that we're talking about, and you're absolutely right, it is a subset of the larger population,
Mm-hmm.
but that subset expands enormously
Enormously.
from say 1820, when it would have been a relatively small number of individuals who would have worried about steam engines, say, or something like that, all the way to 1890, roughly, let's say, when the people are, crashing the gate to the Chicago World Fair so that they
Oh,
can see the
that's
latest thing. Okay.
right. That's right. Yeah.
So there we are in a single lifetime. We have this transformation of the way that people regard technology and technological change and the numbers of people in the West. Now, you're absolutely right. I need to be a little bit more specific about that. So I'm talking about the urban West
Yeah.
in many ways, or at least once we get into the United States and we have a large and relatively, historically speaking, relatively prosperous rural middle class. We're talking about people who have access to information and who have access to the technological choices that we're talking about. They can take trains, okay? They can go across the country. By 1890, for example, it's no big deal to get in a train and into a train in Hoboken.
Which,
And
like, let's say 30 years prior to that, not even perhaps 30 years, but some years prior to it, it would have taken him several months to go from, let's say, St. Louis to the coast of California with a wagon.
well,
No?
by 1860, several months is a little bit of a stretch, but still, again, that's why I started at 1820 because, in fact,
Yeah.
that railroad shift
Hmm.
is beginning to take hold. So that by 1860, for example, we actually do have the ability to move across certainly the eastern half of the United States very
I,
readily.
I was
And
also
already,
referring to the earlier days, like 1820s,
right,
1830s, when
right, right,
locomotives were
right,
not in,
right,
in, in
right,
wide
right.
usage. Yeah.
Right. That's right. But you can see now why I tend to pick on the middle of the 19th century as the kind of transforming period, because you can
Yeah.
now see these enormous shifts, both in terms of transportation and then in the case of a telegraph, in terms of communication. And these are astonishing shifts. But may I pick up on one other aspect of your question?
Sure,
Uh,
please.
and that is when you're talking about who. Um, one of the things that happens when technology changes choices, it changes the choices in different ways for different people, as I've said. But that has an interesting implication that particularly historians should be paying attention to.
How so?
It changes power. The power relationships among people are fundamentally dependent on the choices that people have. That is to say, the effective choices. What can they really do? And it's sometimes
when you say power, are you talking politics or are you talking consumership?
I'm talking both.
Both, okay.
I'm talking at all levels of power, in the sense that if I am let us say I am a craftsman. Let's say I make pianos in 1820. And that's not a trivial craft, by the way, in 1820. Pianos are beginning to be popular and then that kind of thing. By let me get this right, again, about 1860 or 1870, my craft had been totally wrecked in some ways, if I'm not keeping up to date, by the fact that I now have iron frame for my pianos. I can now stamp them out in large factories, and pianos can now be produced on a factory scale that me, the little old piano maker of 1820, are totally floored by.
So you're upset because of this new technological advancements in manufacturing, because it's putting you out of the job.
If I haven't kept up, yes. Or it's forcing me to do things in a different way. That's right. So when you look at whether people like disruption or not, again, you have to put it on that personal scale. An aspiring middle-class woman of 1860, am delighted to have these new pianos available to me. Okay, my parlor.
I see. That's the other side.
Exactly.
Depending on who you're looking at. So this is you're not looking at it as disruption in a negative sense or with any ill connotations. You're welcoming it because now not only you can play it, you can have a less expensive piano for your children.
Right. That's right. Exactly. Or let's take the classic example of technological resistance. The Luddites, the machine breakers of Britain in the around the 1820s and 1830s. The classic Luddite is actually a handloom weaver, somebody who makes their living, not a great living, I might add, but nonetheless makes a dependable living by taking in cloth, and by 1820, I mean taking in thread and yarn, and by 1820, that thread and yarn, I might add, it made in a big factory with machines. But I am doing well because my thread and yarn, thanks to those machines, have become a lot cheaper. But nobody come up with a good way of weaving. But when the weaving machines began to come in the 1820s and 30s, I am livid. But again, now I turn my attention to a consumer, even a relatively poor consumer on the East End of London. Wow, I have cloth now. I can actually get, and not just any cloth, really nice cloth, not crude, roughly woven stuff, but really fine cloth made of linen or cotton or a combination or wool and that sort of thing. Knitting machines also come in at this time, so I can have stocking. Oh my God, that's fantastic. But the stocking knitters of Nottingham are going beside themselves because, of course, these machines are throwing them out of work.
And the way I remember that history, it's been a while that I've read about it, but they actually take to violence, and it takes the British government and imprisonment and executions to sort of quell that rebellion. That's a great example, and the term Luddites has sort of stuck with us ever since. I, I want to bring up two cases I've always wondered about. When electricity transitions from its early years, where you were saying if you can afford it, to have lights in your home, and I'm just talking about lights, what happens to thousands and thousands of candle makers? Are they out of a job? Is there a backlash?
Well, it works a little differently in that there is a transitional technology, at least in the urban West, and that is gas.
Oh,
So
that's right. Yeah,
again,
yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
the 1820s, we began to get gas systems coming in. And again, typical of these technologies, they come into large cities first, and sometimes only the wealthier part of large cities. But gradually they're growing and they become the basis for street lighting, which is a pretty amazing technology in itself when you think about its social and economic implications. But we have these gas systems. So, in fact, when the electric light start to be available in the 1880s and in the 1890s, there are not that many people crying for the gas people. The gas people are unhappy, but everybody else, they haven't made any great friends, I might say, at this point. So to break the gas monopoly, in a sense, is part of what's going on. So
So
the candle makers, nobody is worrying about them by the 1870s or 80s for the most part. I think I can say.
interesting. That's a great point. The transition takes some time. I just wanted to share with you. It's not a question. Just I'm just sharing something interesting that I experienced as far as technology. During the break, I told you that I used to practice patent law for a New York law firm, and they had a word processing department, and I practiced for several years, and I could never find a reason to use the word processing department. Like, what do
Right,
you, what do you use it for?
right,
I type, I correct, and yet the word processing department continued to be there because the older law partners, so I was, 20 some years old, they were in their
right,
late 50s or 60s and some 70s. They would come, they would handwrite stuff, give it to the word processing department, they would turn it
right,
around.
right.
By the time I was there, word processing was still doing that for the older partners, but they were also transitioning themselves into graphic designs and graphics and what have you. It's kind of like we were saying about the piano craftsman. If you don't keep up,
Right,
you're obsolete. You become obsolete.
right.
That's sort of my personal experience with that.
But there's another example, if I can attach to that, and
Please.
that is, I went through something of a similar experience, but in a very different context of an academic setting.
Uh-huh.
And when I started at the University of Maryland, there were secretaries. And when you wrote a paper, you were expected to write it in whatever form you had and then hand it to your secretary. And they would then give you back some kind of typescript at
That
that
was
point. And
presentable, actually, right?
exactly. And you had to go through these various iterations. And of course, uh, I, I started at Maryland in the early and mid 80s. So already, in fact, the secretaries had been issued portable computers, the first what we used to call luggables, the
Luggables.
Osborne
Oh,
the
I love it.
Osborne and the K-Pro computers, big fat things that were nonetheless cheap enough that you could actually fold them up into a suitcase size device, uh, and so you could see the secretary undergoing the transition. Uh, and then eventually the professors basically said, here's your computer, you do it, kind
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah.
So that's actually our classic example of technological unemployment, if you will. But it takes time. So it's not that you're firing all the secretaries. It's just that when the secretary quits or moves on or finds something better, you don't hire another one. You just give a couple of more professors some computers. And that to me was a very interesting experience to see how technological displacement actually works.
You know, in all of the examples, whether it's personal to me and you, or going back in history that we talked about so far, none of the technological transformations are cataclysmic. I'm using that in sort of in the temporal setting. They're not
Right.
sudden. Here, everything changes. All of it
Right.
seems to be transitional. I'm sure for the person who doesn't have a job at some point, that becomes cataclysmic. But largely, is my assessment correct here?
You're right. I mean, the most of these transitions uh, are in fact very gradual. Uh, and if we begin to discuss AI, I will illustrate to you how astonishingly gradual that all is. Uh, uh, that these things take typically a couple of generations to actually uh, uh, begin to burrow themselves deeply within society, and uh, that is typical. Uh,
I'm excited to discuss with you AI's impact on society, and we have a whole segment on that that's going to come up. And to just confirm what you're saying, even though the automobile was invented and was used by some people, the elite in the society, it took many, many years, decades before it really started changing society, and you started seeing it in wide usage on the streets. We'll be back after a short break to talk about our culture of constant improvement.